Politics is compromise. Diplomacy is compromise. Effective leadership is compromise. If we want a future of peace and prosperity based on equity and solidarity, leaders have a special responsibility to achieve compromise in designing our common future for our common good. Now, unquote, those were the words of the UN Secretary General, His Excellency Antonio Guterres, when he met the press ahead of the high-level summit at the UNGA 78th session in New York. Welcome to the only show that brings you happenings in the world of diplomacy and international relations. My name is Harriet Nartey. The show comes off every Saturday between the hours of 4 to 5 o'clock p.m. and we are also in over 40 African countries and in some parts of Europe via satellite. So you can always follow us and get to know what is happening in the world of diplomacy and international relations. Today on the show, we will be focusing on the 78th UNGA, United Nations General Assembly meeting, which takes place at the United Nations headquarters in New York every year. We will be talking about the UNGA itself, and we will talk about how much of impact that has had over the years when it comes to what we are doing as world leaders come together to look at how best to address issues that humanity is faced with. My guest is already seated. I will take a break. When I come back, I will introduce him and we will delve right into the issues for today's episode of the show. Welcome back. We are looking at the United Nations General Assembly, the 78th edition, which is currently ongoing in New York, the United States of America. It is a platform that harbors all the world leaders where they come and speak about issues that they are faced with. With me is an expert who is well known when it comes to peace and mediation, a senior UN officer who will be helping us to really understand. Now, beyond that, he's also served as the Deputy Foreign Affairs Minister for our dear country, Ghana, and we would want him to really take us through the nitty-gritties of what really is happening when it comes to the role of the United Nations, the 78th edition, 78 years of its existence. How have they fared? Where are we going when we live in a very chaotic world? But how do we all come together? His Excellency Emmanuel Bombande is our guest on today's episode of the show. Excellency, welcome to Diplomatic Affairs.
Thank you so much.
It's such a pleasure. You have been in and out of the country, and we know you've been very busy with the activities at the United Nations, the 78th General Assembly. This is not new. This is something that you do so well when it comes to your work. We would want to know exactly where you are coming from in terms of your career journey, and then we would delve right into our assignment for today.
No, thank you so much, Harriet, for this opportunity. So I belong to a unit called the Mediation Support Unit, and this unit is located in the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs of the United Nations. Now, this unit basically looks at policy formulation, mediation practice, and the type of research that goes along with it, and how the United Nations then supports various political missions of the UN, various peacekeeping missions, member states of the United Nations, and to that extent, any request to the United Nations in terms of the expertise and the support that makes it possible for the UN to continue to play its role. Now, what has happened increasingly is that the UN, as it was established, was a convener of dialogue, of mediation, but you would observe that increasingly, the UN is not necessarily at the center of it, but at the periphery and supporting all the dialogue efforts. And so in my work, most of it has been on the African continent. In the Balkans, I've advised on how to minimize hate speech and promote dialogue in Montenegro. I've worked in other regions of the Balkans, but most of my assignments have been Sao Tome and Principe in Africa, the Comoros, the Kingdom of Lesotho, the Kingdom of Eswatini, Cameroon. But in Cameroon, it is Canada as a member state that has offered mediation support. It is still, I would call it, in terms of preventive diplomacy, pretty much alive, but not necessarily, because progress has been made. And these would be some of the examples that I will cite. In some of them, there has been good impact, there has been prevention, but I always say that when prevention occurs, nobody knows about what you did because violence did not break out. It is only those areas, such as Sudan, where I was part of the initial team that worked on the transition. You know, the UN had a peacekeeping mission in Darfur, and we had to collapse that mission into a political mission called UNITAMS. And that then led the efforts working with the African Union and IGAD for a transition to democratic governance. Unfortunately, it was truncated by the recent very violent civil war, and that mission has been drastically reduced, and there are efforts to try and see where that would lead us to. And so these will be samples of the type of work that I have done, not to mention that in our own region, I've also done quite a bit of work in Senegal. Particularly one of our reference of democratic states that increasingly is confronted with political violence and what it means to be able to stabilize.
Yeah. Right. Now, you know why we've had to get him to actually speak on this as we look at the United Nations 78th General Assembly meeting in New York. Now, let's go straight to the point. You were in UN. How long were you there?
So in terms of my career with the UN, when I transited out of my civil society roles, I first worked with the UN Office for West Africa and the Sahel, where His Excellency, our own Mohammed Ibn Chambers, was my boss. And then
Africa's pride.
Africa's pride. From that assignment, I came back to serve honorably and with respect to the people of Ghana as Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs and Regional Integration. After we handed over in January 2017, I had a 3 months rest. Then I went to the UN mission in the Central African Republic called MINUSCA, where basically I advised a high-level panel of the African Union on how to bring the 14 armed groups in the Central African Republic to the table of dialogue with the government of Central African Republic. That culminated with the February 2019 Khartoum peace talks. It yielded the Peace and Reconciliation Agreement of Central African Republic. But I'm quick to add that its implementation has been rocked with difficulties and not to the expectations that some of us wanted, and the country continues to move on. But it was at the end of that assignment that I joined this particular unit, and I've been there now for, I would say, 6 years. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. That's wonderful. Yeah. Were you at the United Nations for the 78th UNGA?
I was part of the preparatory phase, particularly the work on our new agenda, which the Secretary General launched in terms of the first policy draft in July. That will be the focus of the summit for next year. And then I did other preparatory works in supporting our special envoys. I left New York just before the start of the 78th General Assembly. And this time around, I was supporting work in Libya and the Comoros, revisiting where we are, and then trying to make sure that the agenda in some of the files that we are pursuing stay alive, and then ceded the space and came back to, well, continue to work, but also have a good break and then go on to my next assignment.
I'm going to go around the theme for this year's UNGA, rebuilding trust and reigniting global solidarity, accelerating action on the 2030 agenda and its sustainable development goals towards peace, prosperity, progress, and sustainability for all. Now, this actually captures everything that the world isn't at the moment. Would you agree?
I think you are spot on with your observation. Rebuilding trust and reigniting global solidarity. If I were to respond to you, where in the world today are we lacking trust? It is directly amongst the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. To the extent that as the General Assembly has been evolving in terms of our world leaders presenting their statements, concurrently, there have been meetings because some countries are threatened, according to them, by the phenomenal rise of China. And so there are meetings to mitigate that rise and to see it in the context of a competition in which some describe as de-risking, because if China were to rise so rapidly, it will be against the interests of others. So the question and the reason why you are spot on is, where is the global solidarity when there is such a deep level of suspicion and mistrust amongst nations? And I would want us to be looking at it as we talk from the prism of the African lenses to what is happening globally. And there is no question about the fact that the more there is good international cooperation and trust, the better it is for Africa. But the more there is that divide and suspicion, then it becomes more a much deeper challenge for Africa to be able to meet the type of interest that we continue to evolve. And so the fact that this team has been basically at the forefront of the global debate in 2023 tells you a lot. Just take the Sustainable Development Goals, or others would describe it as Agenda 2030, in which we have key goals that we aspire to achieve collectively for equity, for justice, ending poverty, making sure we are promoting peace. Where are we? We are at midpoint, the 2030 agenda, but we've only achieved 15% of any achievable tracking of those goals. And part of the reason is precisely because of the lack of global international cooperation and the suspicions that we are talking about. And so that tells us a lot. And to that extent, the world indeed is in a crisis. But if there is any time more than ever before for international cooperation, it is now. Because some of the challenges that our human community is confronted with can never be resolved by any 1, 2, or 3 countries. It doesn't matter how powerful and how wealthy they might appear to be. The climate crisis is something that if we don't collectively work together, we will not be able to respond to. And so we are all in it. Then the worsening of violent conflicts around the world and the lack of the solidarity that is exactly the opposite of what the team is looking for. And I want to refer you, just yesterday, the foreign secretary of one of the permanent members of the Security Council was speaking in Washington yesterday. Her remark was that the 1951 Convention on the Protection of Refugees, which has now made it compulsory for countries receiving asylum seekers to give them protection, is a threat to the West. Now, that is a remarkable statement of everything that a politician can say that goes against the currency of international solidarity.
Quite a revelation.
It is. But if I may add on to that, the reason why there is so much lack of solidarity, the reason why there is so much mistrust, suspicion, is precisely because when you talk about solidarity, you refer to the human person, men and women. And that we see in our humanity the need to support one another. And so our common interest, that is the pursuance of our human welfare, is what defines the solidarity. But we are increasingly adrift in a world in which the human person no longer counts, no longer matters. Compassion no longer exists. Human suffering has no meaning. And those who have a lot of wealth, and a lot of that wealth was generated not because of they themselves, but because of the exploitation of so many countries, including ours in the global south, are now very protective, to the extent that when they see people moving into their countries, they interpret it as a threat. But when they speak that language, they speak to a political audience, mostly of the right-wing political parties, in order to continue to have political power,
right,
maintain that power, and continue to dominate. And so these statements are deliberately formulated for a political audience in order to continue to win political power.
right.
But deep down, when they go to bed, they know there is something wrong with our human community. So the question then is, how do we talk about rebuilding trust and re-establishing global solidarity when deep down I describe what we currently confront as a leadership crisis? And this leadership crisis is not pertaining in Africa alone, it is pertaining across the globe, in which leaders see themselves, their selfish interests, and the motivations of maintaining political power more than the woman with a baby and a load of provisions on the back and trying to seek refuge. And currently, we are seeing the thousands of people moving out of the enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh into Armenia, because Azerbaijan very quickly brought this enclave under its control, though for a very long time it has been internationally recognized as part of Armenia. And so this is the challenges, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in the Balkans, whether it's on our own continent, the world is confronted with a multitude of global crises. And I want to end on this note with this emphasis. One crisis exacerbates the other. And so you then have a tripling and a quadrupling of crises that merge. And maybe to be very concrete and practical for our viewers, take the unprecedented flooding in the northeast of Libya, in Derna. For almost 13 years now, Libya has been going through the type of conflict that divided a once prosperous nation into the eastern half, led by General Haftar Khalifa, and then the government in Tripoli, led by Prime Minister Derna. So what you then see happening is, when it comes to the management of a country in terms of the details, and to be specific, was it last week the spillage of Akosombo Dam had to be opened for water to flow out, so that the dam is at a safety level.
Right.
Otherwise, the water can overwhelm the banks and it will break. And there will be the type of flooding that we saw.
Right.
And I think due to, they had to spill the dam. In our northern neighbor Burkina, they had to spill the Bagre Dam. But in Libya, because of the lack of a system of governance, of national unity, a lack of maintenance, of state investments, these dams have not been maintained for long. And when in 24 hours, they had a rainfall of almost 1 year, and the water just surged into these dams, they broke open and swept multitudes of people into the ocean. And as the Secretary General of the UN remarked, where the bodies of people were being taken out is where the super rich people of this world come with their yachts for holiday. And so this is where we find ourselves in the world. a world of very wealthy, rich people who are living a life that can only be sustained when the other part of the world continues to be in the type of poverty and misery that we are talking about. And that speaks volumes in terms of how do we organize ourselves to be able to confront this. And this is where you look at the impact of climate change, you look at the absence of peace and security in Libya, they fit into one another.
And leadership also.
And of course, leadership. And even as we speak, one would have thought that the leadership of Libya would put everything aside and begin to talk about that unity. And the special envoy has been visiting the East and talking with leaders. On the humanitarian front, they were willing to reach out to one another. But beyond that, they have not showed any interest of bringing... Politically.
What is power if it doesn't really serve humanity?
Precisely. If, you see, the whole question about political power is to be a legitimate and credible representative of your people internationally. But that becomes effective because you are managing that power responsibly for the interests of the people who elected you. And that's why there is a linkage. When you appear on that platform in the General Assembly of the United Nations, your credibility begins with how you exercised that power at home.
Right.
If at home, your use of that power, even after you were elected, was not to bring the unity, the peace of the people with the type of policies that is constantly reflective and mindful of their welfare at the social, economic, and political level, you are only standing in the General Assembly, but you lack credibility.
Exactly.
And that is where it's a reaction that is symptomatic of what we see represented at the global level, but it begins with our national levels. And people take responsibility of leadership too lightly. And that is why, if at the end of the day, the verdict is that your exercise of power actually impoverished your own people, made them worse off, even when you are not held accountable for the use of that power, it will stick with you for the rest of your life, and it will be your legacy. And that's why in our advocacy for good governance, it's not about elected leaders, but it's about our common interests and our collective effort, particularly those of us who are vulnerable, because the world is weighing heavily against us. And the worst thing we can do is when amongst ourselves, we do not show that responsibility. And this is where it becomes sad. Some of our African leaders were in New York, but back home, their political leaders were in jail. And what was the reason for arresting them? For organizing political demonstrations and protests, which is what political parties do. And as you can see, I'm respecting your diplomatic platform, so I'm not mentioning the names of countries.
I appreciate that. I really, really appreciate that. I do.
But when you go to the General Assembly and you make these statements, but everybody knows that back at home, your people are divided. People are raging with anger. The resources and the wealth of the country have been used in such a way that those who occupy that power that we call political power, their immediate family, extended family, and members of their political parties are seen to be doing very well, and everybody else is seen to be constantly impoverished. It creates a problem. And that's why significantly this year, and I don't know whether you observed it, there are countries in which thousands of people came out on the streets to demonstrate the presence of their presidents in New York, to carry the flags of their country.
Whilst the meeting was in session.
Whilst the meeting was in session. And so you are beginning to see that particularly the younger generation, is beginning to express itself in such a way that they are saying enough is enough. And so activism is no longer happening at national levels,
but at the global level.
But at the global level.
Very interesting. Now, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, whose words I borrowed from the beginning during my introduction, in his opening remarks, also again talked about the new world order, from a bipolar one to a multipolar world, which comes with its own turbulence, if I can put it that way. Currently, our world is faced with so many issues, so many problems, conflicts, lack of solidarity, mistrust, economic hardship at all levels. If we have to move from the bipolar level to the multipolar level, are we to anticipate a smooth landing?
Very interesting the way you formulate this question. So, very quickly, I would look at it, but I'll also look at it from the purview of our African political interests. And so we suffered the most when there was what you describe as a bipolar world, in which there were two superpowers.
Right.
And in those superpowers, what then happened in Africa was that if you were aligned to one of the powers, they protected you regardless of what you were doing wrong. And so different African countries ideologically were aligned to the extent that some of the worst corruption and dictatorship happened during that bipolar period. So there is a president whose daughter got married, and he hired the Concorde for his daughter and the husband to fly for their honeymoon. That's the level to which African leaders were so corrupt to sink their nations, built his village into a capital, and because his favorite drink was Coca-Cola, he built a Coca-Cola factory. That happened during the bipolar period of this world. But then at the end of, so then we had what we call the Cold War. Because the Cold War was the competition between the superpowers. It was offered and you knew where you belonged. And that comes in our founding president, Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, when he gave that famous speech. And he said, we face neither east nor west, but we face forwards. Because he was making the emphasis that Africa needed to define its own place in this world in such a way that we don't align. Because when we align, there are consequences.
Right.
And that is why we also became a founding member of the non-aligned movement. But then, after the when we now come to the post-Cold War, when the bipolar competition ended, we went into you might call it brief, what is a unipolar world. And that was simply the dominance of one superpower.
Right.
And that superpower, basically, if you would describe it,
that's the United States of America.
That's the United States of America.
Ruled.
Yes. And their presence weighed heavily everywhere in the world. Now, we are seeing the emergence of what you are calling the multipolar. In fact, let me say, we might describe it as the emergence, but it has already emerged. So if you look at the BRICS, whether we like it or not, we are going to see more and more of a multipolar world that probably we should be asking, how does it help Africa? The bipolar did not help us.
Right.
I explained more in detail.
Right.
The unipolar did not help us.
Obviously.
Now we're entering the multipolar.
Right.
So the questions we should be asking is
that the answer to our problems?
Is that the answer to our problems? But I think it will be more about what kind of political leadership do we bring? I see it as a new opportunity. But it would be an opportunity that can be channeled to the interests of Africa depending on how we use it. So first of all, it's about our voice. So in the multipolar world, we want the voice of Africans to be heard and to be heard loudly. You cannot shut down 1.2 billion people who are Africans. And I've not added Africans of the diaspora. But that voice has to be a voice of principle and of values. A voice that respects inclusion. So that is one aspect. the value and the principle that we choose our leaders freely with peace and credibility, but not to go to every election with violence. Nobody can bring that to us. So whether our opportunities now in a multipolar world would be effective is also about how we govern ourselves, how we elect our leaders. Again, diplomatically, I will not mention the country. But one president was just sworn in, and the first thing he did was his son has been appointed as a deputy minister, and his cousin, another deputy minister. We cannot continue with these old habits and talk about new opportunities in a multipolar world. So what I'm saying, Harriet, is this. Opportunities are only opportunities, beginning with how we organize ourselves to take advantage of them. If we are not well organized, if we think that politics, management of the economy, the social spaces are ones that must be dominated by one group, and whether the others like it or not, they have no say, there's going to be chaos. If there's chaos, don't talk about opportunity. And I would add then onto that, how are we taking care of the vulnerable in our societies? How come that some people can be so wealthy, they have everything, and in the same country, others go to bed hungry? That must interrogate our conscience. It must call us to action and to say that peace is only possible because there is justice for all. And this is a global phenomenon.
Yes.
And I walk on the streets of New York, and if you see the number of people begging just to have a meal, it's incredible. So it's not only for the developing world, it's also happening in the very wealthy countries. And that's why in the beginning I said our humanity has lost compassion. And to that extent, we now need to reframe where we are going. But since your question looked at the multipolar world, my answer to you is that you are right. It presents new opportunities. One, for example, is the BRICS. Let our voices be heard. But let our voices be heard because it's on principle. The difference between Africa and other parts of the world. Take Asia. Whether we like it or not, Asia has its own problems and challenges. But Asia is making sure that they are taking people out of poverty year in and year out. Their economies are growing and people are beginning to feel a sense of belonging. But that does not mean there are no problems. But to come back now to your question, which puts the spotlight on Africa, I think, and I think your question is also connected to the opportunities that are provided by a multipolar world that is emerging and accelerating in very fast ways. I strongly believe that when the attitude and behavior of any leader does not resonate with key principles and values that are acceptable by the society and the country in which that leader leads, there are bound to be problems. So if you look at our West African community, why are we having the set of problems that we are having now? And that would respond to your question about whether or not the way we organize ourselves can now be taken to the level of seriousness that is desired. Now, you realize that we have become always reactive to crisis when the crisis happens. But we refuse to be preventive, aware that the crisis will come.
Right.
Why is this the case? It is the case because leadership is comfortable with actually even being part of the problem and creating the crisis, and now trying to react to the crisis in a way that does not resonate with the wishes of the people. So what you are seeing happening, if you look at West Africa, is that there's a drift between the people and their leaders. And we're seeing that in the Sahelian countries. So, if the principle is in our 2001 supplementary protocol on democracy and good governance, let us practice good governance. Because when we practice good governance, we create an environment in which coups will be needless. Because people are going to say, are you crazy? Why do you want to lead a coup d'etat? Look at what is happening. But we renege on that. a president insists that the constitution will be changed, but it is for a selfish motive, for that president to serve a third term. The rest of the West African leaders are quiet. The constitution is changed. People protest. And here I can mention one example, Guinea, because I have been 5 times with my principal at that time in preventive diplomacy, doing everything to persuade this leader not to embark that path. He did not pay heed. People came out to protest. Not less than 100 people were killed, and we don't talk about that often. The person makes sure that he wins the election. Then the West African leaders congregate at his inauguration and praise him for what he has done and his success as a leader. Why wouldn't a military overthrow such a president? And when the military overthrows such a president, why wouldn't the coup be popular? Because that military ruler, in a sense, has liberated the people who were being shot at for protesting and wanting the principle of democracy to be installed. And so we refused to be preventive when the crisis was building up. But we then reacted to the crisis, which was not a coup d'etat. Nobody will take us seriously when we behave that way. And so my response to you is, when you now sit at the table of negotiations at the global level, people are not looking at how you are reacting. In fact, those who are praising you for how you are reacting are those who have a self-preservation and a self-interest in how the outcome of the way you manage the crisis will continue to fit their political interests, which is often colonial-dominated, exploitative in character, and not in resonance with the wishes of the people. And so we're seeing an increasing conflict between the people who are seeing some of their elected leaders as collaborators in a negative sense with powers that collude with multinational companies to continue to extort and to exploit. And so my response would be, let's organize ourselves in such a way that when we are at that table in the international sphere, our presence is felt, not because of what we say, but because of the way people look at us. It's basically the language of, you cannot mess with the African anymore.
Right.
Because they know what they want, there's clarity in what they want, and they're negotiating on a win-win outcome for the interests of their people. How is it possible that military rulers who were not elected
were recognized
in the type of speeches they made, and leaders who were elected, yeah, they also made speeches, but people are like, what is in it? And so there is an agency. The majority of the people are young people. They have access to new telecommunication capacities. They see how the world is going. You cannot stop them. And so I would say, let's be preventive in capacity, in representing the interests of our people, and legitimately we will get what we want in the new opportunities of a multipolar world.
Very interesting conversation today as we look at the 78th United Nations General Assembly meeting in New York, the United States of America, with a focus on Africa. We are talking about how the United Nations can still, if it still has that power for which it was created, its mandate, 1945, is that right?
Yes.
To bring the world together, to provide security, to maintain peace. If the UN still has that power, what it takes to continue to serve as a global police to the world. We've been talking about African leaders and speeches made at the United Nations 78th session. Very powerful speeches. I would want us to begin with reforms at the UN security. How much of an impact can this make?
So first of all, when you talk about the reforms, for the perspective that allows the context to be understood, very briefly, the current United Nations system was created at the end of the Second World War in 1945, as you observed. And basically what happened was that the powers that were the victors were the ones who then determined how our global community should never go back to the type of war that we experienced in the First World War and in the Second World War. And so the United Nations Charter became our most valuable document that should guide our humanity and prevent another scourge of war, which should never happen in our lifetime. But when you open the very first page of that UN Charter, it does not talk about we the governments. It talks about we the people of the United Nations. And so it goes back to your very first question, that the context of we the people is about the people of this world in solidarity. But what you have seen since 1945 is that the people have increasingly been marginalized by their own leaders. And so we have powerful countries, and then we have what you might call mid-level, and then you have the weaker ones. But the reason why reform is resonating so clearly is because nobody has a counter-argument to the fact that you don't create an organization that reflects the world in 1945 to still be that same organization that can be effective and efficient in 2023. And so none of us as African nations was even there and participating in the United Nations as it was established. But even more to that, try to look at how it was established with 5 permanent members who have veto power.
That is the United States, France, Russia, China, the United Kingdom.
That's it. And it doesn't matter what you say or what you do, if these 5 permanent members do not agree, forget it. And so what we call the highest peace and security architecture of the world is the Security Council. The Security Council has 15 members. Of the 15, 10 are non-permanent. Okay. And Ghana is currently a non-permanent member. Right. And Africa normally would have 3. Okay. And we call ourselves the A3, Africa 3. Then you have the permanent, which is called the P5. But where we are in the world today is that the P5 is polarized, or maybe the word divided is a better word, between the P3, which is France, Britain, and the United States, versus China and Russia. Now, I started by saying if we want to re-establish trust, it must begin with this P5. But they are the ones who are most distrusting of each other and pulling the world now into different directions. But it's not just at the level of government. It comes down to even companies. I'm sure you've heard about countries who do not want official mobile phones to have TikTok application on them because there is a certain perspective about TikTok. Or if you're using Huawei, you must be kind of liking China. And it goes on. So it boils down to those finer details. So what we now need is that reform must look at how we restructure the organization so that everybody's voice is equal. If we want to take the formula that we should have permanent members of the Security Council with veto power, then let it be representative of everybody in the world. And Africa is the continent without any permanent seat.
If Africa were to be given a permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council, how do we choose which African country actually represent the African interest?
Okay, so this is where I will give credit to our African Union, or I will give credit to our African leaders, because they foresaw this. And so in a valley resort in the kingdom of Eswatini, in a place called Wultini, they formulated what was called the Eswatini Consensus. And what that consensus basically does is, one, to call for the reforms of the Security Council and the entire structure of the United Nations. And to be very clear about the seats that Africa wants. So we are demanding 2 permanent seats. Okay. But we will now have a conversation around whether our 2 seats are part of permanent representation in which there are equal veto powers, or whatever formula we want to have those 2 seats. But amongst us, we then agree that African issues would be debated with the type of African consensus that allows our 2 permanent members to carry it into the United Nations. So that if there is an issue around climate change, don't worry about Africa's voice, because we will determine.
There's a representation.
Exactly. And you could see last month before the General Assembly, we had a summit in Nairobi to have an African common position on climate action.
Right.
Which
where a declaration was made.
Exactly. And we are going to carry that to the next COP28 as an African position. So in that regard, we made that type of progress. But I think the challenge now underlining your question is the call for reform sincere and genuine? Sometimes some of us are skeptical because we feel that even as the world sees the permanent 5 constantly in antagonistic relationships
at each other's throat,
behind the scenes they do have coffee together and basically accept to have hegemony.
Right.
And that is why it doesn't matter who calls for reform. These 5 politically do not have the will, because it's in their interest to continue to dominate the world.
Right.
And I have had this opportunity to ask a very undiplomatic question. I asked, and this was a Russian high-level diplomat. I said, why don't you table a resolution in the Security Council to start a debate on the reforms? If you truly say that you are in solidarity with Africa and you love Africa and you are the friend of Africa, put on the table a resolution. Now, Africa then will be able to know who disagreed. Then we will now know those who are against us.
Those who want us to succeed and those who don't want Africa to be a par with
Exactly.
them.
But you come to us and you say, we are your friends. We are in solidarity with you.
But we've
we
also
are
had the U.S. president's call for
Yes,
reform.
President Joe Biden, and to give him
publicly stated the need for Africa to be part of the UN.
Exactly, and he did that in 2022.
Right. Do you think that was just for the cameras?
I like, not in all places,
okay,
but to some extent, I like President Joe Biden for his boldness. But I want him to go beyond that, just as I have stated for Russia. If the United States today was to table a resolution on UN Security Council reforms, it will have traction. Why is it not happening? And I think this question, I'm afraid every African legitimately can have that question asked. All our leaders are asking for reform. Members of the Permanent 5 are asking for reform. Everybody is asking for reform. Why are we not having it? And one way to look at that is, we all know it's going to take time, so let's continue to see the reform speak to us. Let's reform ECOWAS. In 2015, when President John Mahama was the chair of ECOWAS, one of the agenda items in the summit in Accra was to limit the term of the presidents in West Africa to not more than 2. So that in those countries where a term is 5 years, you can have your two terms, and that will make 10 years.
Right.
In Ghana, Nigeria, where it is 4 years, you can have your
2 terms without going beyond that.
Without going beyond that.
Right.
Then, at that time, Togo said no. Gambia said no. Cote d'Ivoire was ambivalent. But the working formula in ECOWAS is that you must have consensus from all the 50 member states for a decision to be carried. So it kind of was left in limbo. Last year, March 2022, Ghana hosted the Africa Union Forum on reforms of our continental multilateral institutions. And one of the choros in Accra was to go back to those reforms, and Ghana being chair of ECOWAS in 2022, Ghana again under President Nana Akufo-Addo brought back the agenda on the table. This time, Cote d'Ivoire was openly against it, and we know why. Senegal openly was against it. Togo did not change their position, and Gambia, we do not know where they are. And the reason is because some people are dreaming that if I support it, when I want to change the constitution, it will go against me.
Exactly.
And that is why I talk about principle and values. And I can say this because I'm one of the few people who have had the opportunity to dance in civil society, in governance, and in the UN system. And even at my junior level of deputy minister, I woke up every morning with the sense of responsibility to serve. And that is why when you are leaving, you thank the people you served. And I'll never forget that in the foreign ministry, my boss, Hannah Tete, the current foreign minister, she invited us back to the ministry,
Honorable Shelley
Ayuko-Botwe, and we had literally a working lunch in which we were appreciated. That's what should happen. That's what should happen. So that there's transition, peaceful, respectful.
Right. We had only one permanent member made an appearance at the high-level summit.
Yeah.
And that is the United States of America's
Yeah.
President, Joe
Yeah.
Biden.
Yeah.
We don't know what happened to the rest.
Yeah.
The 4 permanent members.
Yeah.
Is that to say that they are not interested in the affairs of the United Nations anymore? Is that to show a disinterest in the global organization somehow?
Harriet, I'm sure if you research in diplomatic cycles, representatives of these countries will tell you they had good reasons why they couldn't be in New York. But diplomatically speaking, by not being at the General Assembly to make a statement, they considered the issues to be less a priority for their interests. And that's the way we can probably frame.
We talked about how these countries, these 5 permanent members,
Yeah.
have the veto power.
Exactly.
And we are calling for reform
Yeah.
at the highest level
Yeah.
of the United Nations.
Yeah.
We are talking about reparations,
Yeah.
speeches delivered by African leaders.
Yeah.
We are talking about the exploitation of Africa.
Yeah.
We are talking about not exporting our resources in its raw form.
Yeah.
We are talking about all the things that we think work against Africa.
Yeah. It confirms the weakness of the political leverage of the UN Security Council. There's no other way to look at it. It affirms that its foremost multilateral role as an institution that the whole world belongs to is no longer given the due gravitas and respect that is deserving of it. And the Secretary General has lamented over this several times. It underscores our incapacity to come together as a people of the world to solve global problems.
Has the UN been hijacked by its permanent members?
In fact, the UN, I will replace the word hijacked with paralyzed. To the extent that some people started to appreciate more the General Assembly. Because that's where debates are happening, and every country, it doesn't matter how small or big, we have 1 seat each.
Right.
And that we could end up with a vote like in our parliament for people to see where we are weighing towards. But the Security Council, which then happens to be the highest global architecture, primarily responsible for providing the policy direction and framework for peace and security, is the one that is divided, and its political leverage is weakened every day, and we see that.
That is the core of the global organization.
Exactly. And that's why we're on a slippery road. And let me, maybe to give it a bit more of explanation. When the Russia-Ukraine war broke out, the 3 African countries in the Security Council are the ones who spoke looking at a way forward by underscoring how do we restore peace. The others spoke in terms of the violation of the sovereignty of Ukraine. But we all know that
Right.
Ukraine's sovereignty was violated, and under international law, that was wrong. But it does not mean because it is wrong, you now pursue a war that continues to kill people and create a global crisis because one was wrong. And that's exactly what the United Nations was created for. It was created so that when a member state behaves in a way that is wrong, you find a political solution to address that wrong. And how do you do that? Dialogue. And so Africa was emphasizing on let's have dialogue to resolve this problem as soon as we can. Some people even were ridiculing Africa. Who are you to talk about dialogue? But they have no alternative. And when you listen to them, it's about send more tanks, send more warplanes, send more weapons. And where has that ended? Now, the Security Council should have been the guide, providing the moral compass about how we solve this. But they themselves are so divided that by the time they sit down, they are at each other's throat. And so the Security Council became irrelevant in responding to the Russia-Ukraine war. And we are continuing to drift as if we are completely helpless. But our humanity, from the lessons of World War I and World War II, created the UN so that we don't go back to those crises. I was in Helsinki last year when the foreign minister was lamenting that Europe, that used to be the architecture for peace, is no longer the architecture for peace, and was actually calling on African diplomats to support Europe in the war on Ukraine. And Africans were like, even in the pandemic, you in Europe, you were hoarding the vaccines because you thought that we will not survive. If we had all died, who would you call to support you? This is where our world has reached. And he was very emotional when he heard African diplomats speak very frankly about how we were hurt. That even on the common solidarity of sharing COVID-19 vaccines so that our humanity can survive, wealthy countries had enough and they now bought the vaccines and stored them just in case. And other countries were just living on the edge.
What do you make of the president of Ghana's speech at the UNGA? He talked about so many things. He talked about corruption, the tag around African leaders as being corrupt. He talked about reparation.
Let me be frank with you. I'll quickly look at three things. One, nobody's tagging Africa of corruption. You see, there is not a scientific monitoring, research, and knowledge acquisition about what is happening daily in African countries. And this is led by Africans. And it is Africans who are talking about their governments being corrupt. It's not somebody else who is tagging African leaders. I'm not saying there's no corruption elsewhere. In fact, yesterday there's a senator in the United States. People are asking him to resign because he's involved in some corrupt deals with some Egyptian company.
But there's a difference. People think that people are held accountable.
Exactly.
Sanctions are placed on people.
Exactly.
But in our world, in Africa, hardly do we see people being punished.
You have made my
for
point.
Wrongdoings.
You have made my point. Because that senator is politically damaged. Because the issue about corruption cannot allow that senator to survive politically. But in our context, the reason Africans are very angry is that not only do they know that corruption is happening, but when they know that corruption is happening, they are told that whether you like it or not, we are not corrupt, and you have to go home and accept that. So that's point number one. The second point that has to be made is that we talked about it earlier. Your credibility in the General Assembly begins with your own management at home of governance, so that your credibility is diminished when the way you are governing at home does not resonate with the global standards, principles, and norms that we want. If you look at all this, our president talked about historical injustices, which everybody talked about. That was not unique. But you see, you don't talk about the injustices of the past and be mute about the injustices that are happening today. Since he became president, our president has never talked about the Palestinian issue for the justice of the Palestinian people, which is one of the core issues of global insecurity and conflict. He's never called for the lifting of the embargo on Cuba, but he flew to New York from Cuba. And that injustice is happening today. Now, if you cannot talk about the injustices happening today, and you only want to refer yourself to the narrative of the past, something is missing. Which goes back to the theme of the 78th General Assembly: re-establishing trust, reigniting global solidarity. Don't even talk about the world. You and I know how Ghana has benefited from the Cuban Medical Brigade in supporting our healthcare system. When Cuba continues to be embargoed economically and suffocate, one place that we can support Cuba in solidarity is to call for the lifting of that embargo.
Thank you very much for your time. We really, really appreciate it. And I'm sure we will find the opportunity to do this again.
Thank you so much.
Yes, there's so much to talk about.
Thank you so much.
We really appreciate your time. All too soon, this is where we draw the curtain to another insightful, informative, and educative episode of Diplomatic Affairs. It has been quite revealing, very punchy, very direct, and I know some would say, ooh, this is not really the usual, diplomatic talk that we have on the show. But like I said, diplomacy should be frank and honest. At the end of the day, you have to be able to look, at yourself in the mirror and do a self-introspection. Or as a country, we need to look at ourselves in the mirror and assess ourselves. Therefore, it is important that we begin to look at where we fall short and how we can also contribute to the global discourse by, if we are asking for a seat at the table, what have we to offer? How much can we offer? How relevant can we be? And how can we use the powers that we seek to also make an impact in the lives of the people that we serve? At the end of the day, you need to make sure that the power you seek serves a purpose, and that is humanity. My guest has been the UN Senior Mediation Officer, His Excellency Emmanuel Bombande, and also former Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of our beloved country. Thank you so much, Excellency, for your time.
This has
been very, very, someone would say, very eye-opening. And for us as well, it's been very, very educative. We are super, super grateful to you, as always, for sticking and staying with us and getting all the details and information when it comes to diplomacy and international relations. My name is Harriet Nartey, and I look forward to seeing you again, same time next week. Enjoy the rest of our programs.
Hello, information.
Madam,
Me, I have still not got the money for that list of expensive building materials you sent to me. The price of the iron rods have been increased too much, are they?
Madam, relax. Look, that's not why I even called. I just visited IPCP, where the engineers told me everything about your fast floor.
Please, those people are expensive. Are they not the people